Welcome to our podcast on successful AUTOSAR transformation. My name is Christoph Ebert. I'm the Managing Director of Vector Consulting Services, and I will give you some insight into what makes successful AUTOSAR transformation. This is part 3 of a 3-part summary on our experiences with AUTOSAR transformation projects in the past years. And we will talk here about a specific tool, which is called the Vector AUTOSAR HealthCheck. This HealthCheck is an instrument to give a brief 360 view into the technology domain, the process domain, and the people or competence domain, which all together need to be available for successful AUTOSAR transformation. It has been used in many projects. Typically, we do that in the beginning to find out what would be risks and how to best mitigate the risks along the AUTOSAR migration. Part 1 and 2 have provided experiences from our AUTOSAR projects, and one typical challenge which we see across many such projects is that the typical competences along technology and process are insufficient. For instance, we see agile organizations which do not anymore pay close attention to good traceability. That means a change doesn't really ripple into the whole framework. Signals have wrong names, inconsistent names, labeling is done inconsistently, timing conventions are not considered, etc. Typically, the whole introduction crashes with insufficient integration, specifically if Tier 1 and OEM do not harmonize along their interface agreements. So the AUTOSAR HealthCheck looks into these specific traps. It's not an ASPICE assessment. It's, as I say, 360-degree. Looking into technology, process, and competences. With this AUTOSAR HealthCheck, we combine industry best practice with our own experiences in AUTOSAR projects and being a leading supplier of AUTOSAR worldwide. Let us start with these 3 dimensions to get a brief overview. We have the technology dimension with AUTOSAR design elements, modeling, model-based development, quality requirements, analysis, the assessment of architectures, consistency of requirements, etc. Tools, that is typically the tool chain for creating the underlying software, the interfaces. This is consistency, for instance, along these different tools. Code quality analysis, but sometimes also safety if you use AUTOSAR in a higher ASIL environment. The competence dimension looks into hard and soft competences. The hard competences overlap very much with the technology needs. AUTOSAR, architecture, quality. Soft competences, much more about methodology. How do I specify and model architectures? How do I analyze architectures? How do I make sure that my ECU or service architecture from the application perspective fits to the AUTOSAR stack? How do I best configure the different tools? And of course, the change management, that is what would be necessary to move from today development into tomorrow development. What kind of challenges would there be? How do I mitigate? How do I inform, for instance, my suppliers? How do I document the result? How do I document design decisions? All that are typical challenges in AUTOSAR projects. From a process perspective, a major risk is that many companies today are not anymore on a solid ASPICE 2 or CMMI 2. That means we see often deficiencies along configuration management, traceability, project management, and verification validation. So here we look into exactly these process domains, both engineering and base process. Base process in terms of Is there sufficient understanding of config management, project management, etc.? At the same time, we also look into what are the methodologies for verification, validation, for architecture, modeling, specifying, etc. This, in a nutshell, is the content of the AUTOSAR HealthCheck. Let us, as an example, look into the domain which is kind of overarching all these three topics of technology, process, and competences. And this is the roles which we have in AUTOSAR. We have typically three roles which we need: the requirements engineer, the architect, and the software engineer. And each of these roles has a very clear need on the way they are working. So this can be coined a competence dimension. But if you look into architect, for instance, the architect has to model the interfaces, architecture patterns, make an architecture analysis, maintain the documentation. This needs a profound technology understanding, not only the modeling, but also the deployment, the technical dimension. And that means here we move into the technology domain. At the same time, we also have process dependencies. For instance, how do we ensure integrity of the interfaces, of the signals, of timing requirements, performance, reaction time, etc.? How do we measure the underlying architecture quality? What are the tools which we need for architecture assessment? How do we connect different tools with each other along the, let's for instance say, use AUTOSAR XML, RxML, that is a XML specification language for the interfaces, where typically a lot of tools, parsers, guide checkers, etc. would be used. How do we keep those consistent? So we see even in this small microcosm of the architect, we have dimensions of competence, technology, and process. And that all has to fit together, because it's not only this one role. We have configuration managers, we have a lot of software engineers, we have testers, we have system engineering people, etc. And that means the whole workflow from architecture drivers, for instance, into the implementation with the code quality, with the consistency checks of the tools, all have to be ensured. This is what we check with the AUTOSAR HealthCheck. Let us look how this AUTOSAR HealthCheck is actually implemented. It's a nice 1 week exercise, which we do in the way of a workshop. Mostly we do that online because it is less in effort, and it's also allowing us to get different multiple expertise from our consultant pool into this, depending on the challenges which we have. It can, of course, also be done on-site, depending on the specific travel restrictions. First day would be an overview and understanding the process and the product landscape, the dependencies, project management. That means more general topics. Second day, we dive into left side, upper part of the V, requirements, system analysis, architecture. Day 3 is a really deep dive. We look into technology topics, the tools, but also the methods to be used, how an architecture would be specified, code quality, competences of the architects, of the systems people, of the engineers. Then day 4, we look more into topics like implementation, configuration management, also verification, validation, and day 5, we look into the change process. And of course, we consolidate in order to deliver a report which can be used to close the related risks. So in a nutshell, it's a 5-day exercise, a tool which gives you a perspective, 360-degree, along where you are with respect to technology, understanding and technology risk in introducing AUTOSAR, the competences and the process. You will get a list of the top risks, proposed implementation for the mitigation activities, and we will also revisit your roadmap of the specific AUTOSAR project, like you want to introduce AUTOSAR in the ECU and multiple ECU on a system level, or even on a complete vehicle level. that would also mean dedicated activities where we would help you in order to make this roadmap useful. So the health check clearly gives a good insight into how you can best mitigate your risk, what are industry best practices, together with a lot of practical hands-on AUTOSAR experience. This being said, I thank you very much for listening to this podcast and wish you good success with your AUTOSAR migration. You can reach us anytime at www.vector.com/consulting. Thank you and stay tuned.